Welcome to the 2025 North of Falcon presentation for the Upper Columbia and Snake River areas. I'm Ryan Lothrop, the Columbia River Fishery Manager, and I'll be walking through most of this presentation. And then Matt Gardner will come in and cover Region 5. Trevor Hutton will cover Region 3. Chad Jackson will cover Region 2. And Chris Donnelly will cover Region 1 areas. So this presentation will cover the harvest management jurisdictions, the North of Falcon and Pacific Fishery Management Council schedule and public commenting, environmental factors, forecasts, and returns, last year's fishery summaries, and this year's forecasts and proposed seasons. So what is North of Falcon? North of Falcon is an annual preseason salmon setting process. And within the Columbia River, we also incorporate upriver summer steelhead since those fisheries overlap. The name refers to Oregon's Cape of Falcon, which marks the southern boundary of the North of Falcon management area. This is one of several large salmon season setting process areas, which involve state, tribal governments, federal regulators, and other U.S. states, as well as Canada. So what guides North of Falcon? Well, fishery managers must weigh several factors, including the Endangered Species Act, commission policies from various states, Pacific Salmon Treaty obligations, tribal co-management, which includes treaty tribes managing their own fisheries, and sampling and monitoring of fisheries statewide. So under the various jurisdictions, you have the Pacific Salmon Treaty, which is a U.S. and Canada agreement to carry out fisheries and enhance programs on transboundary salmon stocks. This allows for fishing access as well as escapement to natal spawning grounds. The Pacific Fishery Management Council is one of 8 fishery management councils established by the Magnuson Fishery Conservation and Management Act of 1976. The council has a jurisdiction over the federal waters of 3 to 200 miles offshore and manages commercial, recreational, and tribal fisheries for about 119 various fish species in federal waters. Under U.S. v. Washington, also known as the Bolt decision, this is a court decision that reaffirmed the reserved right of Washington Treaty tribes for fishing. This covers areas such as Puget Sound and the freshwater areas within Puget Sound. And U.S. v. Oregon is a federal court proceeding issued in 1969 that provides treaty fishing rights for the Yakima, Nez Perce, Umatilla, and Warm Springs. The associated management plan details salmon and steelhead allocations between the treaty and non-treaty fishers. And the U.S. v. Oregon Management Agreement provides treaty and non-treaty allocations and the ESA limits. So there are some additional jurisdictions that I'll go over on this slide here. First off is the WDFW and ODFW policies that provides detailed non-treaty salmon allocations between recreational, commercial, and lower and upriver fisheries. Additionally, Washington state law established in 1939 requires a state to reserve an allocation of salmon to the Wampum Band for ceremonial subsistence purposes. There's a WDFW and Colville Confederated Tribe Share Agreement that reserves an allocation of salmon and steelhead for the tribal subsistence and ceremonial purposes. And additionally, there is an Endangered Species Act that provides year-round coverage for fisheries as prescribed by various management agreements. This year's North of Falcon meetings kicked off on February 28th with a release of the forecast in Olympia. There are 2 Pacific Fishery Management Council meetings, one in March and one in April. Then there are 2 Columbia River North of Falcon meetings. Of note, March 18th is the Upper Columbia and Snake River North of Falcon meeting, which will be in Wenatchee for an in-person meeting. And then for the lower river fisheries, that'll occur in Ridgefield on April 3rd. And additionally, there are 2 statewide meetings. The North of Falcon public meeting process will conclude on April 15th at the council meeting in California. For those who cannot attend meetings in person or virtually, you can provide written comment at the portal provided at the link above. And we suggest that you provide these comments before, during, or after any of the public meetings, but well before the April council meeting, so staff have the best available information to take into consideration upon finalizing the preseason planning process. All right, so moving on to environmental factors, which will cover the physical environmental conditions, some biological responses, and forecasts for the marine environment. First off, on the physical side, there's temperatures, and you can see with this graph here that the temperatures have been increasing over time. And even as recent as January 2025, the global sea surface temperatures were well above the 20-year average and was the warmest January on record. So in a bit more detail, there have been recent marine heat waves through most of recent years, such as the warm blob event in 2015, 2019, 2020, 21, 22, and 23. Looking back as recent as last year, you can see that it's not as deep dark red off the Washington and Canada coast. So we were fortunate to avoid a marine heat wave last year. And you may have heard of El Niños and La Niñas. On the left is a La Niña, and that results in cooler, wetter conditions for the Pacific Northwest. And then there are El Niños, which is warmer and drier conditions. La Niñas are better for our salmon stocks, and El Niños result in lower survival of our salmon stocks. So this figure here shows how conditions have changed over time, with as recently as a El Nino in 2023 to 2024, and then we going back a few more years, 2020 to 2022, we had 3 La Niñas stacked up, and currently you can see in the blue there we are currently in a La Niña stage. So moving on to the biological response, we have what may look familiar to you as the stoplight chart that is data collected and transcribed into this visual by NOAA. They've been collecting this data since 1998 and other data prior to that, and have been collected every year since, all the way through 2024. The data collected covers basin type and regional indices, as well as biological and physical factors. Some physical factors include the PDO and sea surface temperatures, and biological indicators include a type of food source such as zooplankton. The reds are poorer relative sense, and the green is better or best, and then yellow is more kind of neutral. And so these are all relative to the time series. In a couple key years highlighted there, 1998, 2004, and 2015 to 2019 were very poor conditions. 2008 and 2021 were, for example, really good conditions. This year, looking at 2024, is trending a little down or worse off than the last 2 or 3 years, but it's relatively neutral state. So additionally, this is the juvenile salmon catch. This is one of the variables on the stoplight chart for coho and Chinook being sampled in the trawl fishery conducted by NOAA surveys off the coastal waters of Washington and Oregon. They observed higher than average juvenile Chinook and coho salmon abundance, but primarily in May off the Columbia River mouth. Then additionally, we saw a return last year resulting from, the 2022 and 2023 ocean conditions, and when there were smolts out in the saltwater, resulted in record-breaking sockeye return, strongest chum run in over 40 years. And for this year, indications are based on the forecast that there may be a record return of pink salmon if it were to come to fruition. So moving on to the marine environmental forecast, going back to El Nino and La Nina, kind of looking forward in time. So these are the average of 3 months increments. So January, February, March in the first column, for example. And then the last one would be September, October, November. So what you see here in blue is the La Nina forecast chance, versus gray is neutral state, versus red is El Nino. So we're coming off of a La Nina into a more neutral state with a slight chance of an El Nino coming into shape later this summer. Additionally, looking at sea surface temperatures, on the left figure there, and kind of the blue outline, that's the areas of the surveys to assess sea surface temperature. And the figure on the right shows the various stocks. And basically the message here is that all the different stocks experience different aspects of the ocean. So some will experience warmer conditions, while others will experience cooler conditions, which is why you don't see uniform type returns. You see a variety of returns, such as will come through the forecast. Some stocks are going to be forecast to be lower abundance, and others much higher. So the take-home message are that our salmon smolts entering the ocean experienced moderate to good ocean conditions over the last 4 years. The La Nina is projected to weaken this spring and transition into a more neutral state this summer. So the Northeast Pacific sea surface temperatures are increasing, and the salmon that are returning will experience warmer water conditions. Additionally, our snowpack is below average, which may result into warmer summer stream temperatures. The marine heat waves shifting from coastal environments in the deep sea, Northeast Pacific, are driving a higher uncertainty in some of our forecasts. Some species can actually take advantage of the situation, adapt, or change their behavior, while others just are unable to accommodate these changes. So in conclusion, there are consistent trends in the ocean conditions over recent years that suggest this year's salmon survival and returns are going to be similar to last year's returns. So moving on to forecasts and returns. This is for upriver salmon, so that's salmon and steelhead, destined to waters upstream of Bonneville Dam. Last year's actual return was 1.9 million fish, which is primarily composed of Chinook and sockeye, which is similar to the 2022 return. So for upriver spring Chinook, last year's actual return was about 116,000 fish. And these are, again, spring Chinook destined to waters upstream of Bonneville Dam. This year's forecast is 122,500, so slightly above last year's actual. And the dot denotes the forecast. And the various colors comprise of the Upper Columbia in orange, Snake in blue, and Mid Columbia in green. For upriver spring Chinook again, and then also Snake River Wild. Last year's aggregate upriver return was 116,000, and the forecast is 122,000, as was presented in the previous slide. In black there is the wild run in the Snake River. So last year's actual was 10,514 fish, and this year's forecast is a little bit below that at 9,800. For the Upper Columbia spring Chinook and wild forecast returns, last year's actual was 18,224, with this year's forecast slightly improved at 21,500. The wild component had an actual return of 1,609 fish, and this year's forecast is slightly improved at 2,200 fish. For Upper Columbia summer Chinook, last year's actual return was 42,511. This year's forecast is below that at 38,000. As you can see, this year's forecast is similar to last year's actual, as well as 2018 and 2019's lower returns. For Columbia River sockeye, last year's actual return was, as previously mentioned, a record return since Bonneville Dam counts, and so the estimate was 761,682 fish. This year's forecast is about half that at 350,200 fish. However, you can see there's been an increasing trend on this run, which is primarily comprised of Okanagan and Wenatchee stockfish. For Columbia River fall Chinook, last year's return was just shy of 670,000 fish, and this year's forecast is slightly higher at 717,400 fish, which is primarily made up of upriver bright and the various Thule stocks. For upriver bright fall Chinook and Snake River Wild, last year's upriver bright return was 318,089 fish, and this year's forecast is just slightly below that at 313,400. For the Snake River Wild component, last year's return was 12,657, and this year's forecast is below that at 9,000 fish. And for the Columbia River coho in ocean abundance, which is pre-ocean fisheries, last year's return was 736,982 fish, and this year's forecast is below that at 479,739 fish. And for upriver coho passage at Bonneville Dam, we had an early component return of 143,767 and a late component return of 26,167, resulting in about 170,000 fish returning. So moving on into summer steelhead, first off with the A index component, which is primarily made up of one ocean salt aged fish, but there are some 2 salts that make up a small proportion. The aggregate return last year was 121,579, and this year's forecast is 55,600. The wild return last year was 36,543, and the wild forecast is below that at 19,000 fish. For the B index component, which are the larger steelhead, they primarily return to the Clearwater Basin and are comprised of primarily 2 ocean salt aged fish. Last year's actual return was 48,166, and this year's forecast is below that at 11,800. And the wild component's return last year was 4,115, and this year's forecast is 1,100. As you can see, since about 2014, there's been an every other year uptick and then a drop off, and that trend continues based off the forecast we see. So we would have been expecting a downward step based on the correlation between odd and even years and environmental variables associated with that. So this is the 2024 fishery summary of days open and closed for the various upstream areas for spring Chinook, summer Chinook, sockeye, steelhead, and fall Chinook. So circling back to summarize our forecast for upriver spring Chinook, it is slightly below the 10-year average. The Snake River component is 56,200 hatchery and wild fish combined. The Yakima component is 2,600 fish. And then for the icicle, we do not have the forecast available at this time. For Upper Columbia summer Chinook, this is well below the 10-year average. However, it is above the escapement goal of 29,000 fish. For the upriver bright fall Chinook, this is similar to but slightly below the 10-year average. The Hanford Reach estimate is about 81,500 fish, which of about a third will be wild. For the Snake River, the forecast is 50,200, of which about 18% are wild. For upriver summer steelhead, both A and B index are around 50% of the 10-year average, and the wild index proportions are provided as well, 57% for A index and 34% for B index as compared to the 10-year average. And for sockeye, 350,200 fish forecast is right at the 10-year average, of which the Okanagan contributes 248,000 of those, and Lake Wenatchee is 94,000, of which both are well above the escapement target. So for Upper Columbia summer Chinook, we have some details here providing a walkthrough of the fishery allocation guidance. In step 1, we have the USV Oregon Management Agreement, which references a 29,000 fish escapement goal. The remaining abundance is then split 50-50 between the treaty tribes and non-treaty fisheries. And you have to take into account the ocean non-treaty harvest that counts against the non-treaty share. So then the remaining balance becomes available for in-river fisheries. Under step 2 is a state commission policy. The non-treaty allocation is divided between fisheries downstream of Priest Rapids Dam, such as recreational and commercial fisheries. And in lower abundance scenarios, such as this year, results in a higher recreational share of 80% to the recreational sector. Step 3 is to set aside a small allocation for the Wampum Band tribal and ceremonial fisheries. And step 4 is to determine the proportion for fish that move to fisheries upstream of Priest Rapids Dam and the split between the Colville tribe and the sport fisheries. In lower abundance scenarios, such as this year, a higher proportion is moved upstream and for the Colville tribes. And step 5 is consideration of in-season management. The USV Oregon Technical Advisory Committee provides an update to the river mouth abundance, which happens around the 1st of July and would occur weekly thereafter. With an updated abundance, it is then incorporated back into step 1 to determine the new allocations. And depending on the remaining balance, fisheries may be able to be opened, may need to be adjusted or closed. So looking at this year, we have a preliminary preseason scenario on this slide. Do want to make note that the forecast and numerical allocations, sub-allocations are subject to change. Finalized preseason estimates will be available at the conclusion of the Pacific Fishery Management Council in April. So as you recall in the previous slide, step 1 is the USD Oregon Management Agreement. So that's basically the river mouth plus ocean non-treaty catch equates the abundance. And the abundance is subtracted from the escapement goal and then divided by 2 to get to the non-treaty harvest allocation. Then you take out the ocean catch, and then the remaining balance of 2,813 fish is available for in-river fisheries for the non-treaty sector. Step 2 is the commission policy guidance. So 10% below pre-Strappus Dam based on the WDFW Colville harvest share plan. And then of that, 80% is available for recreational fisheries and 20% is available for commercial fisheries. Step 3 is providing fish for the Wampum Band, and step 4 is the WDFW Colville harvest share plan, which 90% is available for fisheries upstream of pre-Strappus Dam. Of that, 70% is available for the Colville tribal fisheries, and then the remaining is available for the pre-Strappus Dam sport fisheries, which is 696 in this scenario. So moving on into the proposed seasons for the main 7 kilometer river downstream Bonneville Dam, the spring Chinook pre-update fisheries have already been set by the joint state hearing. We have a slightly increased forecast for the lower river stocks and a similar abundance for upriver stocks. The pre-update fishery is scheduled to be open through April 6th. For summer Chinook, due to a low forecasted abundance, there is insufficient allocation for directed harvest. Therefore, non-target handle only will be provided to allow for sockeye and steelhead retention fisheries. And we do anticipate some fishing opportunity for sockeye given the forecast. And for fall Chinook seasons, we'll be considering in-season stability measures, again, similar to last year, which may include elements of mark selective regulations, salmon and angling day block closures, consideration of effort shift, and higher handle rates as seen in recent years. We anticipate fishing effort and opportunity to be similar to last year, but upriver bright, Snake River wild Chinook may limit some fishery opportunity. There is sufficient coho harvest opportunities, with most of it occurring in buoy 10. And for upriver summer steelhead, there will be closures with very limited hatchery harvest opportunity due to the low forecast similar to recent years. And barbless hooks will be required. So moving upstream in the main stem from Bonneville Dam to Highway 395 at Pasco, the spring Chinook season has already been set by the joint state hearing and is scheduled to be open April 1 through the 26th. For summer Chinook, again, as referenced in the previous slide, there is insufficient allocation for directed harvest, so non-target handles available to provide for sockeye steelhead fisheries. We anticipate harvest opportunity for sockeye and fall Chinook opportunities will be available. However, the upriver bright, Snake River wild Chinook catches may limit fishing opportunity. The forecast for coho is sufficient for harvest opportunity, and we anticipate restrictions similar to recent years for upriver summer steelhead due to the low forecast. And lastly, barbless hooks are required.
Hello, I'm Matt Gardner, District 9 fish biologist with WDFW. For this presentation, I'll be focusing on Washington tributaries between Bonneville and the Dalles Dam. Rule change proposals for Washington tributaries below Bonneville Dam are still in development and will be reviewed on April 3rd at the North of Falcon public meeting in Ridgefield, Washington. For tributary fisheries between Bonneville and the Dalles Dam, we are not proposing any rule changes at this time. However, I would like to briefly review summer steelhead management in cold water refugee areas for this year, and also discuss the Drano Lake bank fishing only boundary that is implemented during the spring Chinook season. Based on forecast low returns of summer steelhead to the Columbia Basin in 2025, WDFW will continue to implement conservation strategies that minimize impacts to the ESA listed upriver stocks. In Washington tributaries, these strategies are specifically focused on the cold water refuge areas adjacent to the main stem Columbia River, which include the lowest reaches of the Wind, White Salmon, and Klickitat rivers, as well as the entirety of Drano Lake. During the months of July through October, the conservation strategies include closures of angling and retention for steelhead, as well as night fishing closures for salmon and steelhead in these areas. Next, I'd like to discuss the bank fishing only boundary at the mouth of Drano Lake. I want to emphasize that WDFW is not proposing any boundary rule changes at this time, but we are seeking public input to help inform potential management options in the future. You're likely familiar with Drano Lake, but I'd like to take a moment to orient you with the area. Drano Lake is just north of the Columbia River in Skamania County, Washington, between the towns of Stevenson and White Salmon. The specific area that I'll be discussing today is just north of the Highway 14 bridge where the lake meets the Columbia River. During the period of April 16th through June, WDFW has designated a small area at the mouth for bank fishing only. The boundary is defined by a line between the Highway 14 bridge and posted markers on the north shore. Those are currently located in the northwest corner of the lake, as seen here. During the effective dates, the area to the west of this line is open for bank fishing only. This rule was adopted in the early 2010s with majority support at the time to relieve increasing conflicts between boat and bank anglers. Since the implementation of this rule, Drano Lake has seen steady popularity and high levels of angler effort for spring Chinook. Anecdotally, the average size of boats in this fleet have also increased over the years. Due to the manner in which boats fish in close proximity in this confined area, boats are sometimes pushed across the line, and an increase in violations of the boundary line has been documented. During the 2023 and 2024 seasons, WDFW's enforcement has received numerous calls about this location and subsequently has issued dozens of warnings and citations, primarily related to the boundary line infractions. During this time, this area has also seen 3 assaults. WDFW is seeking public input to help address the issues at this boundary line and identify possible solutions. I want to reiterate that we are not proposing any changes to the boundary line at this time. We are only seeking public input to help identify potential management strategies for future consideration. Potential strategies could include movement of the boundary line, as seen in the examples provided here, that reflect some expansion of the bank-only boundary toward the east. In recent years, we have attempted to address the boundary line issues with other strategies that include posts to our social media pages reminding anglers about the rule, as well as temporary placements of a regulatory buoy to help identify the boundary, which we found to be very effective. Through the North of Falcon process this year, we are asking the public to provide any input, feedback, or ideas that you have on this issue to help us develop potential management options for this boundary in the future. Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Trevor Hutton. I'm the Region 3 Fish Program Manager. I'll be covering proposed fisheries for the Yakima River and the Hanford Reach of the Columbia. Starting with our spring Chinook fishery, we have a preseason forecast of around 2,600 adults, which fairly closely matches the actual returns that we saw in 2024 and 2023. Unfortunately, this is below where we hope to be for holding a fishery, so this fishery will be closed unless actual passage at Prosser Dam comes in significantly above what we've got forecasted. And if that were to happen, there would be a fishery opened by emergency regulation. Moving to the Columbia River and our summer fisheries, we have a strong return of sockeye forecast this year, meaning that we'll be retaining the 4-fish limit in the Hanford Reach. We have our two primary areas being the Columbia Point Bank fishery. This runs from just below the I-182 bridge down to the end of Columbia Point. It is bank fishery open to only hand cast lines, and that will run from June 16th to July 15th. Above I-182, we are going to have the season open from June 16th to August 15th. In both areas, daily limit is 6 total salmon. Up to 4 adult sockeye may be retained. Due to low forecast abundance of summer Chinook, there's no retention of summer Chinook this year. Release all other salmon. The 2-pole endorsement is in effect for this area, and barbed hooks are allowed in this fishery. Continuing on with our fall fisheries, in the Yakima River, we have a preseason forecast for around 4,000 adult Chinook, and we do plan on having a fall fishery there from September 15th to October 31st. The daily limit would be 2 adults. Moving to the Hanford Reach, the primary fishery for fall upriver brights in the region, our forecast is improved in 2025 with a forecast of just over 81,000 adults. This includes around 27,000 wild fish and 54,000 from the hatchery. Different than last year, we have a 2 adult salmon limit for the reach, the lower portion of the reach between Highway 395 and the old Hanford townsite power lines. Above the power lines, only 1 adult may be retained. In that lower section, the 2 adults may be comprised of 1 wild Chinook and 1 hatchery Chinook, or 2 hatchery fish. We have a number of various areas with different seasons in this reach, from Highway 395 to the Snyder self-landing line. This is sort of the Tri-Cities proper. That season will run from September 15th to October 31st, with the exception of above the I-182 bridge remaining open until December 31st for the Ringgold Springs Hatchery coho fishery. Above the Snyder self-landing line to the power lines will be open August 16th to December 31st. Again, the extended season to accommodate that coho fishery. And above the power lines to Priest Rapids Dam will be open August 16th to October 15th. Again, that section is restricted to only 1 adult fish. As with some of our other fisheries, this fishery is open for 2-pole use and barbed hooks. Moving on to Ringgold Steelhead, this is open from the I-182 bridge upstream to the power lines. It opens October 1st and will remain open through the spring. Daily limit of only 1 hatchery steelhead, and they must be dual clipped. That means adipose clipped and ventral fin clipped. And we're going to evaluate this fishery in season to see if any changes may need to be made, but we anticipate being open for now. So those are your Region 3 fisheries. Thanks for watching.
Hi, my name is Chad Jackson. I'm the Region 2 Fish Program Manager, and I'm going to be talking about salmon and steelhead seasons in the Upper Columbia River, those between Priest Rapids and Chief Joseph Dams. We'll start with spring Chinook in the Icicle River. At the time of this recording, a forecast of spring Chinook back to the Leavenworth National Fish Hatchery was not available, although we expect one towards the end of March. However, it should be known that certainty in that forecast really is not known until we start detecting pit-tagged spring Chinook through the dam system as they're making their way up to the Icicle River, which occurs during the month of April through about early May. If a forecast is sufficient, expect a season somewhere around mid to late May through about June. And if we do open the season, we will do it through fishing rule change, or more commonly known as emergency rule. So keep an eye on WDFW's website for announcements. Moving on, the sockeye in the main stem Columbia River and tributaries. So seasons for sockeye will be published in the 2025-2026 Sport Fishing Rules pamphlet. We're looking at a daily limit of 4 sockeye, The season from Priest Rapids Dam to Rock Island Dam will be July 1st through August 31st. From Rock Island Dam to Wells Dam, July 1st to October 15th. From Wells Dam to Brewster Bridge opens a little later in July 16th to protect staging and ESA listed spring Chinook on the front end, and closes a couple weeks early September 30th to protect staging and ESA listed summer steelhead. From Brewster Bridge up to Chief Joseph Dam goes back to July 1st to October 15th. This year in the Wenatchee River, Okanagan, and Smilkameen rivers, we will not be opening to sockeye and as well as any other salmon. When I move to the summer Chinook portion, we'll get a little bit greater explanation on that. So sockeye in Lake Wenatchee, again, another great forecast of 94,000 fish. If this forecast holds, likely see a season similar to 2024, where we actually got to open a little bit earlier in late July and probably run that through August. We'll be having a 4-fish limit there. We'll be opening via emergency rule for that area. One thing to note that when we had the record run last year and a lot of fish in early, we did receive a lot of requests from anglers to open that even earlier in July. And so I want to make anglers known, while we hear that and agree that that would be a great thing and to hit those fish even when they're a little bit fresher, our ESA permit dictates when we can open this fishery, and it's to keep handling or reduce handling and impacts to ESA listed spring Chinook that will be in the lake at that time in greater abundance. So the earliest we can really open is somewhere around late July. So last year's season was pretty much about the earliest that we could open. So just want to let folks know that when it comes time for sockeye. So again, keep an eye on WDFW's website and look for announcement for Lake Wenatchee if the forecast holds true. Moving on, the fall Chinook in the main stem Columbia River. So again, seasons and rules will be published in the 2025-2026 Sport Fishing Rules pamphlet. We'll be looking at a daily limit of 6 salmon, no more than 2 adult Chinook. This is a non-marked selective fishery because the vast majority of Chinook released out of Priest Rapids hatchery are not externally mass marked. And then it'll be released all other salmon than Chinook. And so this fishery will occur from Priest Rapids Dam to Rock Island Dam, so essentially the Priest Rapids and Wanapum reservoirs, beginning September 1st and running through October 15th. Moving on to Coho, main stem Columbia River and Icicle River. Seasons to be determined. Again, it's based off a passage in real time over Priest Rapids Dam. Coho up this way have been a little more consistent lately, and we've been able to open some opportunity, but there is still a little bit of boom and bust with that run. And so we really need to make sure that those fish are there and we're not impacting spawning populations or any hatchery broodstock take. So it's kind of a wait and see. And again, we'll open this via fishing rule change as we have in the past. Moving on to steelhead, I want to take a little bit of time here just because it was a great deal in 2024. It was the first time we were able to open the season in pretty much a decade. We opened that season October 16th and ran it through the 20th of January. Main stem Columbia River from the BB Bridge to the Brewster Bridge was open, as well as the Medhow River from the mouth to Burma Bridge. A little bit of results from that fishery. Anglers harvested a little less than 1,000 hatchery steelhead, spent 4,000 angler trips and over 17,000 hours fishing. And so while the 2025 forecast, has been explained earlier, is not looking real rosy, it was a little bit the same last year and it came in much improved. So hopefully this year's run will be a little bit better than the forecast, and that we will definitely monitor that run over Priest Rapids, and the season will be to determined. If we meet the minimum abundance thresholds in our ESA permit, we'll open up a conservation fishery and we'll open that up through a fishing rule change. So keep your fingers crossed. It'd be a great thing to be able to open 2 years in a row on this. A lot of people really enjoyed that fishery. Now moving on to summer Chinook here. So main stem Columbia and the tributaries. So just to kind of recap a little bit what Ryan Lothrop talked about earlier in the presentation. So again, a really low forecast, 38,000, one of the lower ones in recent times. One of the reasons is that Chinook returning to the Okanagan Basin are again expected to be depressed. As folks may recall, last year we had a Brewster Pool Chinook closure to reduce handling on those fish and encourage more to enter the river. And so those fish that were age 4 and 5 last year, the age 4s will be 5s this year, the age 3s will be 4s. And so those similar environmental influences that really knock back their numbers are expected again for this year. Just as another recap, that recreational fisheries below Priest Rapid Dam for summer Chinook are closed in the preseason. Their harvest allocation, which is just under 300 fish, is going to be used for catch and release mortality as anglers target sockeye and steelhead down there during the summer. And that the preliminary recreational harvest allocation for our fisheries above Priest Rapids Dam is just under 700 fish, so not very many. Again, these are all preseason numbers, so what can potentially change that allocation either for the better or the worse? So the first two are the most significant ones. The last one can factor in, but is certainly more minor the other two. So in-season upgrades or downgrades to the run size forecast. So as summer Chinook start entering into the Columbia River, their numbers are tracked over Bonneville Dam. And the USV Oregon Technical Advisory Committee does weekly run size updates that begin somewhere the last couple days of June to the first couple days of July. And those updates begin weekly. And so, for instance, if the forecast holds during this time, then that allocation of just under 700 fish will be what we'll be working with. If the forecast comes in lower, that allocation number will shrink, and conversely, if we completely miss the forecast and it comes in much higher, that number could increase. Secondly, the ocean harvest quota for Chinook. So currently, North of Falcon process not only engaged here in the Columbia River, but certainly in full effect in Puget Sound and the ocean all the way from Alaska down to California. And so one of the things that they set is the Chinook quota off the Washington coast that recreational and commercial fisheries engage in off the Washington coast and even down into the upper Oregon coast there. That quota has not yet been agreed to, and usually it comes in a series of options from, if you will, a high, a medium, and a low. And they weigh the benefits of both of those and other weak stock management, and they ultimately agree upon one, and that becomes the basis for all other fisheries in the area, interior of the ocean. So, for example, if the low Chinook quota is selected, then that might increase our harvest allocation above Priest Rapids. Conversely, if a medium or higher Chinook quota is picked, that could also decrease that. So the table that Ryan showed you earlier that referenced the current ocean harvest, that is a placeholder, that is an estimate based off a couple of year average there while we're waiting for this quota to be decided upon. And then lastly, and as I mentioned, a more minor thing that could change. So any in-season savings of summer Chinook for below Priest Rapids salmon fisheries. So for example, if the fisheries down in the lower river hit all of their ESA guidelines and had to close early, for instance, there may be some unused fish that could be transferred up to the upper Columbia. I don't anticipate that to be very many, but it could be 10, could be 20, could be 50. And we really won't know until those fisheries more or less kind of are over, which is somewhere in early July when the bulk of those fish have passed through the lower river and have entered into the upper river. So, given what we know about the forecast of summer Chinook and that allocation, 700 fish isn't very much to work with. So to begin with, Upper Columbia River and its tributaries are going to be closed pre-season. We will wait for the first and, if necessary, subsequent in-season run size updates to see if we're potentially have more fish to work with or have less fish to work with, maybe even roughly the same. Also at that time, as I just mentioned, that will determine whether there's any savings from the lower river fisheries that can be transferred up to us. And if we believe we can carve out some meaningful opportunity that we can monitor and manage adequately, we will open up seasons via fishing rule change. So keep an eye on WDFW's website for any announcements. However, it should be recognized that, if we are going to carve out some opportunities on a small number of Chinook, that seasons may be restricted to terminal areas such as Chelan, the mouth of Chelan Falls, mouth of the Entiat. And then there's been this thought to maybe allocate any small number to the Entiat River, which is a unique situation where summer Chinook returning to Entiat National Fish Hatchery also stray up into the spawning areas and negatively impact ESA listed spring Chinook. So there is a conservation benefit to that fishery there at reducing those impacts to listed spring Chinook. Also, restriction will be in time. It's possible that we could have a July 16th or later start date. Certainly with an earlier closure, we, like the Snake River, may entertain either singular or 2-day openings. And then obviously a reduced bag limit of probably 1 adult hatchery Chinook per day to help spread any sort of allocation we may have over a longer period of time. One last thing to note is that, so when we're dealing with this quota here, so that the total harvest allocation, so that right now that 696 fish includes fish that are harvested by anglers plus 15% catch and release mortality rate on all released adult Chinook. So if we release 100 fish, 15 of those get added into whatever anglers harvest, and that has to either be at or a little below that 696. And that catch and release mortality rate also includes any handling that occurs in open areas or salmon, for example, sockeye. So you're fishing the Priest Rapids pool, any Chinook handling there would get added on to wherever we might open up some Chinook opportunity if we do. So a little bit of concerns with trying to carve out some of that opportunity is that small allocations are really difficult to proactively manage. So we open the season for a limited number of days. So there's obviously the creel surveys where we talk to anglers, there's the data entry, there's the harvest estimation. And then if we are or have hit our allocation, then there's issuing a fishing rule change. And while we can do that promptly, but that could take a day, day and a half, the fastest that we could do, maybe even 2 days. And so while we have a fishery open and we're trying to figure out where we're at, those couple additional days that we're doing all of these activities back at the office could result in more fish being harvested and being over our allocation. So one thing that sometimes we try to do is we try and forecast how long we think we have on that. So recognize that there is, I'm not saying 700 fish is the bottom line. I don't know if I could tell you exactly what a bottom line would be, how many fish is safe, but we will take that into consideration. And it may just be that if the number's too low, that it may not be worth opening. And so that may be a decision fishery managers take. For reference, last year during the month of July, with even a smaller run that came back, as well as not the greatest of fishing. So the harvest rate during the month of July plus that 15% catch and release mortality rate averaged out to be about 711 adult hatchery Chinook per week. So just to kind of put that in perspective, and that's with all areas except the Brewster Pool being open. So the last thing is what we kind of call internally this gold rush phenomena, where we could have the best laid plans, we open up an area, and because it ends up being the only opportunity that's open in the Upper Columbia for summer Chinook, we get this flood of angler effort that we can't really predict, and then it ends up that catch rates are a lot higher. And so when we're dealing with small allocations, it's hard to know whether that's going to be the case, whether this gold rush phenomenon will result in higher catch just by virtue of more effort, or whether it's not as bad because it's crowded and everyone's in their way a little bit. But it is a worry when trying to carve out opportunity. So that's the summer fisheries in the Upper Columbia. A little bit of a mixed bag. Hope that summer Chinook comes in a little stronger and we can provide some opportunity, but it still should be another great sockeye year with a run of over 350,000 expected, as well as a good number into Lake Wenatchee. So Thanks for now, and I will turn it over to Chris Donley, the Region 1 Fish Program Manager. Thank you.
I'm Chris Donley, Region 1 Fish Program Manager, stationed in Spokane. Today I'll cover fisheries for the Snake River Basin. We'll start with spring Chinook. There are approximately 400 fish available for harvest, which triggers a reduction in fishery area openings. This year, we plan to open Little Goose for 2 days per week, and the allocation for harvest for all of 2025 for spring Chinook is 407 fish. We plan to open the first week in May under emergency rules, and it's depending on run timing and when adult fish are available to be harvested. The daily limit will be 6 salmon, only one of which is a hatchery adult. And once you've retained your adult, you are done fishing for the day. We do not plan to open on weekends. In the past, we have opened fisheries at Ice Harbor and Clarkston as well as Little Goose. The issue that we have is we do not have enough fish available for harvest to be able to open all those areas. Anglers should not expect, unless the run comes in substantially larger than the forecast, that we will be able to offer opportunity at Ice Harbor or Clarkston. Next, we'll move to fall Chinook. We anticipate running a fishery in the Clarkston area and upstream to the boundary that you've seen in emergency rules in past seasons. The fishery will open August 18th and close October 31st under emergency rule. The daily limit will be 3 adult Chinook, no limit on jacks. In the past 2 years, we've run a fishery at Lyons Ferry. Expect that fishery to be open again this year. The fishery should open in early September and run Thursday through Sunday under emergency rule. The daily limit will be 2 adult Chinook, only one of which may be unmarked, and there will be no limit on jacks. If we go through the wild impacts afforded to this fishery, we will adjust it to be a mark selective fishery only. For coho, there is a possibility for opportunity. However, the forecast is lower than the last couple of years, and we will update the run as they come into the river. And if there are enough to afford for harvest opportunity, we will create an emergency rule to open them. As with recent years, we have exceptionally low estimated return for steelhead in the Snake Basin. We will evaluate steelhead returns at Bonneville Dam and Lower Granite and will adjust seasons over time through emergency rules. Anglers should expect that rules for steelhead will be out by September 1st. Seasons could include reduced limits, size restrictions, and possibly area closures. When we think about the Columbia Basin as a whole, for summer steelhead since 2017, there have been fishery limitations based on low index, A index, and B index forecasts, and in some years, even wild B index components. The fisheries were structured with block closures to be productive of fish as they progressed upstream. Run sizes for this year will be updated. A index will be updated weekly starting in late August, and B index is updated weekly starting in mid-September. However, continued low index and B index forecasts relative to the 2017 returns are currently what we are experiencing. Prior to 2017, we saw numbers greater than 200,000 fish annually. To put that in context, in 2025, the forecast is 59% of the recent 5-year average return and only 29% of the 20-year average return. We are exceptionally low abundances of steelhead and concerned about them from a conservation perspective. To add to that, we have some uncertainty around our forecast based on the fact that most of the index population returns as age 1 fish returning from the ocean, or rather, 1 aged ocean fish returning from the ocean, meaning that they spent 1 year in the saltwater. These are hard to forecast, and there is uncertainty around whether we have that number right when we put the forecast out this spring. The proposed season structure for the Columbia Basin for summer steelhead for 2025. There will be rolling block closures from the mouth of the Columbia beginning in August and continuing upstream. There will be consideration for main stem to be closed for the most of the run, July through March in some areas, and anglers should expect night closures in most places. Tributary mouths will be closed similarly to the main stem rolling block closure early summer to fishing for steelhead, and there will be no catch and release, and there will be night closures. Anglers should expect open fishing, but possibly abbreviated seasons on the Snake River and tributaries. Anglers should not expect to fish the upper Columbia above Priest Rapids, as there will not be enough fish to afford for fisheries up there. abbreviated hatchery limits in areas that are open, for example, 1 fish. And if actual returns are lower than anticipated, we may only allow catch and release opportunity. So if you want to put this in the context of rules look like, this matrix lays out from the mouth all the way to the Snake River, how we propose to run fisheries over the period of the Steelhead run. We all thank you for joining to watch this presentation. If you have questions for myself or others that are in regions 2, 3, or 5, please feel to reach out to us or send us an email at these emails that are listed below. Thank you for your time. Have a good day.